I'm sorry, I'm going to move to the language of Shakespeare and to abandon the language of Dante, but at least I won't speak the language of Molière, which is my own natural language, for reasons of translation. In 2005, at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, there was a major exhibit sponsored by the Chinese government called The Three Emperors. The central piece of that exhibit was a huge painting in the Jesuit style, in the European style, which described the long queue of the European envoys to the court of the Emperor of China. And the very explicit message of the exhibit was, China is back. Yesterday, you were paying tribute to us. Tomorrow, you will do exactly the same. The topic of my talk this morning in Milan could be called, Is the West about to be back? This is a very provocative statement, but one that came to my mind as I spoke a few days ago to the head of a major luxury firm. I'd been addressing that firm for years. 7 years ago, I was telling them, go east. And suddenly, the message had changed. We were in agreement. The firm was saying, well, I have to hedge my bets. I'm not disinvesting from Asia, but I'm reinvesting, and very seriously, in the West. The West meaning the American West, the European West, and what they would call the Asian West, i.e. Japan. Why such a turn? What has happened? Is that shift explainable by the beginning of diffidence in emerging countries? The crisis which we are witnessing stems from us. The subprime crisis in the United States, the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. But paradoxically, even if we are at the source of the virus, we have antibodies that may make us more resistant. To put it in a different way, it may be easier for us to sustain non-growth for a relatively long period of time than it would be for emerging countries to move below 7% growth for China, below 5% for India, or below 3% for Brazil. Why? And this is where I come to the comparative advantages of the West, and more specifically, the comparative advantages of the European West. In terms of political culture, if you have no democracy, like in China, if you have no rule of law, like in China or India, the huge disparities of revenues that exist between the very rich and the very poor are only sustainable if the very poor have an element of hope in them. What happens if hope disappears because of the fall in the rate of growth? What happens if hope is replaced by humiliation, resentment, and despair. A few years ago, I wrote a book which was translated into Italian called The Geopolitics of Emotion, in which I was saying that the main culture that dominated the Western world was a culture of fear. Fear of the future, fear of the other. Today, paradoxically again, and at this very precise moment, could we say that hope may be about to return in Europe and in the West? To do so, we have at the same time to acknowledge the radical nature of change, the reduced nature of the West in demographic and economic terms. But we have also to regain the elements which have made us strong in the past and that can recreate us in the present and in the future. We are confronted, we are living in a world where the West is not what it was yesterday. Let me give you one figure. In the 18th century, Europe represented 20% of world population. In 2050, according to all demographic studies, the West should represent a little more than 10% of world population. And I meant the West, not Europe. When I speak of Europe, Europe would probably be only between 5 and 6% of the world. Not an endangered species, but clearly not the dominating West, pushed by the mission to civilize, the arrogant West that was not listening to the other, that felt superior, that thought it had a monopoly for models. What we have to regain today is a sense, again, of modesty, of desire to learn from the others. In fact, there was a moment in our history where elites were looking at each other as equals. That took place between the late 15th century and the early 17th century. There were moments when Jesuits in Asia or Dominican in Latin America were looking at other culture with a sense of respect, with the sense that they were confronting another culture from which they could learn, from which they should learn. If we take that lesson, which means if we look at the other with modesty and shed off the arrogance of the past, then we should look at us with a much greater ambition. In the past decade, we have lived well beyond our means materially and well below our means intellectually and spiritually. We have forgotten what made Europe unique. And I think this uniqueness stems from the encounter between two words, unity and diversity. Unity, it's important to realize what I mean by that. Asians don't feel Asians. In fact, the concept of Asia is a Western concept invented by us to define them. Tell a Chinese that he should see a Japanese as a fellow Asian. He would react in an extremely negative manner. There is not a dominating religion. There was never a common enemy. In the case of Europe, we are the product of an history. We can look at our heritage like an archaeological layer of inheritance. You have the Judeo-Christian heritage. You have the Greco-Roman heritage. You have the Europe of the monasteries speaking Latin, united in their love of God. You have the Christian Republic fighting the Ottoman Empire. You have the Europe of the Enlightenment, in which men believed in men. And then you have this legacy of tragedy, from Verdun to Auschwitz, which sees Europe committing suicide. And being reborn out of that suicide, being reunited by the desire not to see again French and German fighting each other. And this is what created the European Union. This Europe continues to make people dream. In fact, no one in the world dreams of becoming Chinese. There are still millions of people who want to become European. There are thousands of people who are risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean to join the European dream. And Mare Nostrum is a sea where the yacht of the very rich sees the small boats of the extremely poor. This is unity. Somewhere we feel European. That gives us a sense of multiple identity. We are waking up in the morning as Scots, Bavarian. We are eating as British or German, and somewhere we are European. Maybe less the English than the Scots of the Welsh, definitely less than the Italians or many Frenchmen. But nevertheless, there is that sense of unity, of a past made of glory and terrible tragedies. And at the same time, there is diversity. I remember when I was a young student at Harvard University in the early 70s, I would drive from Boston to Washington, 800 kilometers. There would be the same language, more or less the same countryside, definitely at that time the same food, and the same architecture. Make that experience in Europe. Drive from Hamburg east or north. You will come through 5 languages, 6 different types of food, very different countryside, very different architecture. We are the continent of diversity. And this diversity is definitely a source of creativity. If we have a plus in Italy, in France, in Great Britain, in a very specific way, in luxury goods, it is precisely because we are the inheritor of all traditions of excellence, which are based on the link between diversity and creativity. Of course, there is a tension between those two words, which can lead in bad times to explosions of populism, of nationalism. To feel at ease in a world of multiple identity, you have to feel confident in your core identity. And that confidence, we have lost it in the past decades as growth went to Asia and depth accumulated in Europe and more globally in the West. What do we have to do? What can we learn from our own history that should give us back that sense of ambition, which I mentioned before? Because we have been so complacent with ourselves, as if we were resigned that our continent, Europe, would simply return to be, or turn to be, a museum of our own past, a Republic of Venice in the end of the 18th century, ready to be seized, to be peacefully conquered by more dynamic civilization, more energetic people that would turn Europe into a sophisticated kind of Florida. Well, I think political will has been lacking. But the crisis we have faced, we are still facing today, is not at heart an economic, financial, even political crisis. I think it is, by the end of the day, an ethical crisis. And you can define that ethical crisis in many ways. The first one is that a market-driven society has been endangering a market economy. There have been industries, like the financial one, that have been playing with fire, launching product without testing them. What industry in the world, from the automobile industry to the pharmaceutical industry, would launch a product without having tested them? The financial industry did that. Infectious greed met the lack of control, and we were all embarked into a spiral which engulfed us negatively. What threatened a market economy, which in my mind is decisive for the survival of democracy, because a healthy capitalism is a component of democracy, is not only a market-driven society that forgets everything. It's also the fact that we've lost the tools for having a modest and honest state. In fact, I would say that the light for Europe would probably come from the north, should come from the north, because in the Nordic model, you have 4 key elements which I think are crucial for the future renaissance of Europe. The first one, I just mentioned it, a state that is both modest and honest. The second is acceptable level of differences between the very rich and the very poor. The notion of fairness is essential. There is a moment when excessive differences between rich and poor threatens the social consensus, which is at the basis of a country. This is not only a European problem. This is an American problem. In America, between 1970 and 2007, the gap between the highest paid employees and the lowest paid employee in a firm moved from 1 to 40 to 1 to 400. This is too much. And of course, this is threatening even more so countries like China, India, or even Brazil. The third point is parity between men and women. Civilization that give equal chances to 50% of their population are in a stronger position to resist the challenge of the day than those that are only using half of their population or are not using fully 50% of their population. And then there is, of course, the human treatment of the immigrants. We need them for demographic reasons. We have to treat them well for commonsensical and ethical reasons. If we do that, if we move in that direction, I think everything is possible. Not the return of a conquering West, but the return of a modest and ambitious one. Because in the eyes of the world, Europe still remains as the continent that contains a few key words. The first one is reconciliation. Go to Asia, go to the Middle East, travel to Latin America. They still admire the model of reconciliation that we alone in the world have achieved. It doesn't speak to younger generation of Europeans. It's not part of the narrative we should reinvent. At the same time, it's there, and consider how incredibly difficult it is to achieve reconciliation. The second one is, I would say, a more human form of capitalism. Social democracy, a respect for men, an emphasis on the centrality of the right of man. I remember being in Oslo a year ago, and wherever I was encountering Chinese delegations. At some point, I asked the foreign minister of Norway, who had invited me, what are all these Chinese doing here? And he said to me maliciously, oh, you don't know. Norway is the future of China. So I looked at him a bit bewildered, and I said, how come a country of 5 million people be the future of a continent of 1,400,000,000 people? And he said to me, very simple. They are benchmarking. They are going all around the world to see the best social protection model. And they came down on Norway. They know they will have soon to replace external growth by internal one. Chinese will have to spend more and to save less. And for that, individually, they must be more confident in their future. That's why they are in Oslo. There's another story, very micro, on which I would like to end my speech, because I think it conveys in a symbolic manner the nature of my message. A Chinese company specializing in hotel has just opened a luxury hotel in Paris, the Shangri-La. They wanted to recreate there a mixture between 18th century European style and early 20th century Shanghai style around the Bund. And they wanted to create luxury lacquers type of furnitures. And they realized no one in China knew how to do it. And after making long research, they came to the conclusion that the only people who were still knowledgeable about the way to do those type of furnitures were, in fact, 500 meters from their hotel in Paris. A young French army officer had been taken prisoner in 1920 in China, in the civil war that followed World War I. And the conditions were not too severe. He didn't know what to do during those 3 years. He learned the art of traditional Chinese lacquer, came back to Paris, created this firm, and it is that very firm that is today creating those works of art for the Chinese brand. It's like the wine of Bordeaux that was re-given to the French by the Californian in the late 19th century. What do we have to do, Europeans, to make that dream real? First, we have to realize that the challenge is ours. The challenge is not China. The challenge is not India. The challenge comes from within us. We have to accept the reality of change. We have to understand the nature of change. And we have to adjust to that change. That's it. Avanti. Grazie.